The sound echoed through the oak-paneled courtroom like a gunshot. A grown man, a veteran police officer with a badge pinned to his chest, had just drawn back his hand and slapped a black military police officer across the face in front of a judge, a jury, and 30 witnesses. For a fraction of a second, the room descended into a suffocating, breathless silence. Officer Vance Harlan smirked, thinking he had finally put her in her place. But Staff Sergeant Nadia Brooks didn't cry. She didn't shrink. Instead, her eyes went cold, her military combat training locked in, and less than 2 seconds later, Harlan was staring blindly at the ceiling, knocked out cold on the courtroom floor. This is the story of the slap that ended a corrupt career, and the brutal, undeniable karma that followed. The air inside the Oak Ridge Municipal Courthouse was stale, smelling faintly of lemon floor wax, old paper, and nervous sweat. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of dreary, overcast day that seeped into your bones. Staff Sergeant Nadia Brooks sat at the heavy mahogany defense table, her posture impeccably straight. She wore her Army service uniform, the dark blue fabric pressed to a razor's edge, the brass buttons catching the dull fluorescent light above. The medals on her chest were not for show. They told a story of 3 deployments, 2 commendations for valor, and a decade of specialized combat and law enforcement training. Yet here she was, sitting in a civilian courtroom facing a misdemeanor charge of resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. Next to her sat Simon Whitaker, a weary but razor-sharp defense attorney who had spent the last 20 years dismantling the lies of corrupt local cops. Simon leaned over, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "He's going to lie, Nadia," Simon whispered, his eyes scanning the courtroom. "Harlan is the precinct golden boy. He's going to get up there and paint you as the aggressor. You just have to stay entirely calm. Do not let him bait you." Nadia didn't turn her head. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the empty witness stand. "I deal with belligerent, intoxicated soldiers twice his size for a living, Simon. A local bully with a badge isn't going to break my bearing." The bully in question was Officer Vance Harlan. He pushed through the double doors at the back of the courtroom a moment later, walking with a swagger that bordered on comical. Harlan was a large man, barrel-chested and red-faced, wearing a tailored police uniform that looked a size too tight across the shoulders. For 6 years, Harlan had treated the town of Oak Ridge, which bordered the massive Fort Campbell military installation, as his own personal fiefdom. He had a notorious reputation among the locals and the service members. He was a cop who despised the military. He hated the way soldiers carried themselves. He hated that they didn't immediately cower when he flashed his lights. And most of all, he hated being challenged. The incident that had brought them to this room had occurred 3 months prior. It was midnight, pouring rain. Nadia was driving back to base after a late shift, her civilian vehicle moving precisely at the speed limit. Harlan had tailed her for 2 miles before lighting her up. His justification was a swerving motion, a complete fabrication. When Harlan approached her window, he immediately demanded she step out of the vehicle and submit to a search. Nadia, knowing her rights and recognizing an illegal fishing expedition, had calmly refused. She provided her license, registration, and her military ID, firmly stating she did not consent to a search of her property without probable cause. Harlan had lost his mind. Accustomed to terrified teenagers and intimidated locals, the sight of a calm, collected black woman cleanly reciting her Fourth Amendment rights had shattered his fragile ego. He had yanked her from the car, slamming her against the wet metal of her door, barking orders. Nadia hadn't fought back. She had gone limp, complying physically while verbally demanding a supervisor. Harlan, desperate to justify his excessive force, had slapped the cuffs on her and booked her for resisting. Now the trial was meant to rubber stamp his authority. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed as Judge Elias Grant entered the room. Grant was a no-nonsense magistrate, a man with thinning white hair and a deep scowl etched permanently into his features. He slammed his gavel down, taking his seat and peering over his reading glasses at the prosecution and defense. Docket number 409B, State versus Brooks, Judge Grant announced, his voice a low rumble. Let's get through this. Prosecution, call your first witness. Prosecutor Rebecca Bennett, a young attorney who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, stood up. She knew this case was a toxic liability. She had seen the dashcam footage, which mysteriously glitched right before Harlan got physical, but she was pressured by the police union to push the charges forward. The state calls Officer Vance Harlan to the stand. Harlan swaggered down the aisle. He didn't just walk, he occupied space. As he passed the defense table, he allowed his eyes to drag over Nadia, a sneer twisting his lips. He took the oath, his hand resting lazily on the Bible, and sat in the witness chair, spreading his legs wide and leaning back. For the next 45 minutes, Harlan spun a masterful, practiced lie. Guided by Bennett's hesitant questions, he painted a picture of a dark, stormy night where he felt his life was in danger. He described Nadia as erratic, aggressive, and non-compliant. She was shouting profanities, Your Honor, Harlan said, looking earnestly at the judge. She refused lawful orders, reached toward her center console, and when I attempted to secure her for my own safety, she aggressively shoved me backward. Nadia sat perfectly still. Inside, a cold fury was taking root, but her face was carved from stone. She had survived ambushes in Kandahar. She wasn't going to crack because a mediocre man in a cheap uniform was telling fairy tales. Thank you, officer, Bennett said quickly, sitting down. Judge Grant looked over to the defense. Mr. Whitaker, your witness. Simon Whitaker stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked to the podium, letting the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was deathly quiet. Officer Harlan, you testified that my client reached for her center console, making you fear for your life. Is that correct? Yes, sir, Harlan replied, his chin jutting out. Fascinating, Simon said, picking up a document. Because the impound inventory report, filled out by your own precinct the night of the arrest, notes that the center console of my client's 2018 Honda Accord was jammed completely shut due to a broken latch. It took a crowbar from the impound lot mechanic to open it the next morning. How exactly did she reach into a sealed box, officer? A murmur rippled through the gallery. Harlan's face flushed, a mottled red creeping up his thick neck. The silence in the courtroom was suddenly heavy, pregnant with a tension that made the air feel thick. Harlan shifted his massive weight in the witness chair, the wood groaning in protest. His eyes darted toward the prosecutor's table, but Bennett was intensely studying her legal pad, entirely abandoning him to the wolves. She was attempting to pry it open, Harlan stammered, his confident swagger evaporating. The intent was there. She was making furtive movements. Furtive movements, a convenient phrase, Simon said smoothly. Let's talk about your dash cam, Officer Harlan. You testified that the system experienced a corrupted file error exactly 12 seconds before the alleged physical altercation. Is that correct? That's what the tech guys told me, Harlan said, his voice rising in defensive volume. I don't control the equipment. It malfunctions. It does malfunction, Simon agreed smoothly. However, I subpoenaed the maintenance logs for your cruiser, vehicle number 412. The system was serviced and given a clean bill of health the very morning of the arrest. Furthermore, an independent forensic audit of the hard drive, which the judge granted me last week, shows the file wasn't corrupted. It was manually paused from the console inside the vehicle. Objection! Bennett shouted, jumping to her feet. Defense is testifying. Overruled, Judge Grant snapped, leaning forward. His eyes narrowed at Harlan. I am very interested in hearing the officer's answer. Answer the question, Officer Harlan. Did you turn off your camera? Harlan gripped the armrests of the chair, his knuckles turning white. He looked at Nadia, who was staring back at him with an unblinking, utterly calm expression. Her serenity was driving him insane. He was used to people sweating, crying, or begging. Her silent, dignified defiance felt like a physical attack on his manhood. No, Harlan spat. I was fighting a resisting suspect in the pouring rain. Maybe my elbow hit the button, I don't know, but she fought me. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor, Simon said, turning his back on Harlan with an air of complete dismissal. Judge Grant looked disgusted. You may step down, officer, and frankly, I am deeply troubled by the inconsistencies in this testimony. We will take a 15-minute recess before I hear closing arguments, though I believe my mind is already made up. The implication was clear. Grant was going to dismiss the charges. Harlan had lost. The judge struck his gavel and disappeared into his chambers. The gallery erupted into a low buzz of whispers. Nadia stood up, smoothing the front of her uniform jacket. She felt a profound sense of relief, but she kept her face neutral. She turned to Simon. Thank you. That was surgical. He dug his own grave, Simon said, packing his files into his briefcase. I'm going to grab a coffee from the hall. Don't go anywhere. As Simon walked away, the courtroom began to clear out. Only a few spectators, a couple of bailiffs near the doors, and the court reporter remained. Nadia stood by the defense table, picking up her military cap and preparing to wait out the recess. She didn't see Harlan approaching until his shadow fell over her. He hadn't left the room. Instead, he had climbed down from the witness stand and marched straight toward the defense table. His face was no longer just flushed. It was a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. A vein throbbed visibly at his temple. His breathing was heavy, ragged with unchecked rage. You think you're pretty smart, don't you? Harlan hissed, stopping mere inches from her face. He was a foot taller than her, attempting to use his sheer physical bulk to intimidate her. Nadia took a half step back to maintain a tactical distance, her posture rigid. Officer Harlan, the proceedings are paused. I have nothing to say to you. Please step away from my table. You arrogant little... Harlan spat, lowering his voice so the bailiffs across the room couldn't hear, though his aggressive posture had already drawn their attention. You think because you wear that shiny little costume you can come into my town and embarrass me? I own these streets. You're nothing but a... He muttered a racial slur so vile, so venomous, that it hung in the air between them like poison. Nadia's jaw tightened, her eyes locked onto his, cold and absolute. You're a disgrace to that badge, she said evenly, her voice steady and quiet. And after today, you'll be lucky if you're writing parking tickets at a mall. Something inside Harlan snapped. It was the complete lack of fear in her eyes. It was the absolute certainty in her voice. The realization that he had not broken her, and that he was about to face humiliation from the judge, pushed him over the edge of rational thought. In a fit of blind, uncontrollable rage, Harlan raised his right hand, pulling it back past his shoulder. Hey! Shouted one of the bailiffs, Officer David Reed, stepping forward from the double doors. But he was too late. With all his weight behind it, Harlan swung his hand in a wide, vicious arc. The sound of the open-handed slap was deafening. It cracked like a bullwhip, echoing off the high oak ceilings and the marble floor. The force of the blow snapped Nadia's head violently to the side, knocking her military cap from her hands and sending it skittering across the floor. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The court reporter dropped her transcription machine with a clatter. Prosecutor Bennett, who had been lingering near the front, froze in absolute horror. A police officer had just assaulted a uniformed member of the armed forces in open court. For exactly 1.5 seconds, Harlan stood there, his chest heaving, a sickening smirk beginning to form on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally established his dominance. He was catastrophically wrong. When you spend a decade in the military police, deploying to combat zones where the difference between life and death is measured in fractions of a second, Your body learns to react before your conscious mind can process the threat. It's called muscle memory. You don't think, you act. When the strike landed, Nadia's head snapped left, a stinging heat blooming across her cheek. But she didn't stumble. She didn't fall. And she certainly didn't cry out. Instead, her training took over with terrifying efficiency. As her head whipped back to center, her eyes were no longer those of a calm defendant. They were the eyes of a soldier engaging a hostile target. Harlan's arm was still extended across his body from the follow-through of the slap, leaving his entire left side and jaw exposed. His feet were parallel, his center of gravity high and unbalanced, a rookie mistake. Before Harlan's smirk could fully materialize, Nadia shifted her weight. She pivoted on her back foot, driving her hips forward to generate maximum kinetic energy. Her right hand formed a tight, bone-crushing fist. She didn't throw a wild, emotional haymaker. She threw a textbook, devastatingly precise right cross. The punch traveled a distance of maybe 14 inches, but it carried the concentrated force of her entire body weight, fueled by months of suppressed injustice and the sheer instinct of self-defense. Crack. The sound of Nadia's knuckles connecting with Harlan's jaw was entirely different from the slap. It was a sickening, hollow thud, the sound of bone violently meeting bone. Harlan's eyes rolled back in his head before he even began to fall. The sheer, concussive force of the blow snapped his head sideways, short-circuiting his nervous system instantly. His knees buckled outward, like a marionette with its strings cut. His massive, 240-pound frame plummeted toward the floor. He hit the heavy oak defense table on the way down, his shoulders splintering the edge of the wood before crashing onto the marble floor. He didn't brace himself. He didn't put his hands out. He simply hit the ground like a sack of wet cement and lay completely motionless, his arms splayed awkwardly, a thin trickle of saliva pooling at the corner of his slack mouth. He was out cold. Total paralyzing chaos erupted. "Holy hell!" screamed Prosecutor Bennett, scrambling backward and tripping over her own chair. "Officer down! Officer down!" yelled Bailiff David Reed, frantically unholstering his radio. He and his partner sprinted across the courtroom. The door to the judge's chambers slammed open and Judge Grant burst out, his black robe billowing behind him. "What in God's name is happening out here?" he bellowed, looking from the unconscious giant on the floor to Nadia. Nadia stood exactly where she had been. She had already stepped back, creating a safety perimeter. Her hands were raised in the air, open and visible, her posture neutral. She was breathing slightly heavier, but her face was a mask of absolute chilling calm. The red handprint on her cheek was already beginning to swell, a stark contrast to her dark skin. "He struck me, Your Honor," Nadia said, her voice projecting clearly over the shouting bailiffs. "He approached my table, used a racial slur, and delivered an unprovoked physical strike to my face. I neutralized the immediate threat in self-defense. I am unarmed and compliant." Bailiff Reed reached Harlan. Dropping to his knees, he grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, we need EMS at courtroom 3 immediately. We have an officer unconscious." Reed looked up at Nadia, his hand resting nervously on the butt of his sidearm. He had known Harlan for years, but he had also seen the whole thing. Simon Whitaker burst back into the courtroom, holding 2 cups of coffee. He stopped dead in his tracks, dropping both cups. Hot coffee splashed across the marble floor. He looked at Harlan, then at Nadia, then up to the judge. "Bailiff, secure the defendant," Judge Grant shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Nadia. "Moshrochum," Prosecutor Bennett suddenly yelled. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the noise. Everyone froze and looked at her. Bennett was pale, pointing a trembling finger at the ceiling. "No, Judge. Do not arrest her. I saw it. The bailiff saw it. Harlan attacked her. He walked right up to her and hit her." Judge Grant looked at Bailiff Reed. Reed slowly took his hand off his weapon and nodded. "It's true, Judge. Harlan initiated contact, swung on her hard. She hit him back. Once." Reed looked down at the unconscious man. Just once. Get medical in here now, Grant commanded, rubbing his temples. He looked at Nadia, his eyes softening slightly, noting the angry red welt on her face. Sergeant Brooks, lower your hands. You are not under arrest. A low groan escaped Harlan. His eyelids fluttered and he slowly reached a hand up to his face, wincing in agony. His jaw was visibly out of alignment, already swelling to the size of a grapefruit. He blinked, the harsh lights blinding him, completely disoriented. What happened? Harlan mumbled, his words slurred. What happened, Vance? Simon Whitaker said coldly, stepping over the spilled coffee, is that you just committed a felony assault on a military officer in front of a judge, a prosecutor, and 2 bailiffs, and you just lost a fight to a woman half your size. As paramedics rushed through the doors with a gurney, Harlan's bleary eyes finally focused on Nadia. She was looking down at him, adjusting the cuffs of her uniform jacket. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smiling. She just looked at him with the cold pity reserved for a cornered animal. But the real karma hadn't even begun to hit yet, because as Harlan was being strapped to the backboard, his jaw fractured in 2 places, Simon Whitaker was already looking at the courtroom's ceiling-mounted security cameras, the cameras that had captured every single second in high definition. The flashing red and white lights of the ambulance painted the pale walls of the courthouse hallway as paramedics wheeled Officer Vance Harlan away. His jaw, now rapidly swelling to grotesque proportions, was stabilized in a rigid cervical collar. He moaned through teeth that no longer aligned, his eyes wide with a potent mixture of concussed confusion. Inside the courtroom, the chaotic energy began to settle into a stunned, heavy silence. Judge Elias Grant stood at the bench, rubbing his temples, looking at the puddle of spilled coffee and the splintered edge of the defense table. Sergeant Brooks, Grant said, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. Are you requiring medical attention? Nadia stood beside her attorney, her posture as rigid as it had been 2 hours prior. The red handprint on her left cheek had darkened into an angry bruised welt, but her breathing was entirely controlled. Negative, Your Honor. I am fully operational. Simon Whitaker looked at his client, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He had spent his entire career fighting the uphill battle against badge-heavy local cops, but he had never witnessed an immediate physical delivery of justice quite like this. Nadia, that was muscle memory, Simon, Nadia said quietly, reaching down to retrieve her fallen military cap. She dusted off the brim with a sharp, precise motion. Prosecutor Rebecca Bennett was still sitting on the floor by her table, her hands trembling. She looked up at Nadia, her expression a mix of awe and sheer panic. I can't believe he did that, right in front of us. He just threw away his entire life. He threw it away a long time ago, Miss Bennett, Nadia replied, her tone devoid of sympathy. Today was simply the day the bill came due. Before Judge Grant could officially dismiss the proceedings, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a sharp, charcoal-gray civilian suit strode in. He moved with the undeniable clipped authority of high-ranking military brass, though he wore no uniform. He flashed a heavy gold badge at the bewildered bailiffs. Captain David Reeves, United States Army Criminal Investigation Division, the man announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He bypassed the prosecution and walked directly to Nadia, offering a crisp, subtle nod, which she returned. Simon frowned, looking between the federal investigator and his client. CID? What does Army CID have to do with a local misdemeanor traffic case? Captain Reeves turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that the courtroom be sealed and the security footage from the last 2 hours be immediately impounded into federal custody. The assault that just took place is now Exhibit A in an ongoing federal probe. Judge Grant leaned back in his leather chair, his eyebrows practically disappearing into his hairline. A federal probe, Captain? Perhaps you should enlighten the court. Nadia finally let a small, tight smile touch the corners of her mouth. This was the moment. The hidden hand she had been holding for 3 agonizing months. Officer Vance Harlan wasn't just a local bully who hated the military. "Your Honor," Nadia explained, her voice steady and echoing with newfound authority. "For the past 2 years, CID has received dozens of anonymous reports from junior enlisted soldiers stationed at Fort Campbell. They reported being systematically targeted, illegally searched, and extorted by a specific clique of officers within the Oak Ridge Police Department." Harlan was the ringleader. Simon's jaw dropped. You weren't just driving home that night?" "No, Simon, I wasn't," Nadia confirmed, turning to her lawyer. "I am not just a base MP. I am an undercover operative attached to a joint CID and FBI anti-corruption task force. I was driving that specific route at that specific time, driving a vehicle registered to a low-ranking alias, specifically to bait Vance Harlan into an illegal stop." The courtroom was dead silent. The twist hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Harlan hadn't just slapped a defiant soldier. He had assaulted a covert federal investigator who had spent the last 90 days building a RICO case against him. "We needed him on the record committing perjury to establish a pattern of falsified police reports," Captain Reeves added, handing a thick manila folder to Judge Grant. Sergeant Brooks maintained her cover flawlessly, even enduring a false arrest, to ensure Harlan felt comfortable enough to lie under oath today. "We anticipated him lying. We did not, however, anticipate him committing a felony assault on a federal officer in open court." Bennett let out a breathless gasp from the prosecution table. He's done. He's completely done." "Worse than done, Counselor," Reeves said coldly. "We already have warrants being executed at the Oak Ridge precinct as we speak. By the time Harlan wakes up from his concussion protocol, the world as he knows it will no longer exist." Judge Grant looked down at the bruising on Nadia's face, a profound respect settling in his eyes. "Sergeant Brooks, your discipline is extraordinary. The charges against you are dismissed with extreme prejudice. And Captain Reeves, you will have the unedited security footage within the hour." As Nadia walked out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors closing behind her, the first domino in Vance Harlan's catastrophic downfall had just been tipped. Vance Harlan drifted back to consciousness on a sea of agonizing, throbbing pain. The sterile, biting smell of rubbing alcohol assaulted his nostrils, and a relentless, rhythmic beeping drilled into his aching skull. He tried to open his mouth to groan, but a sharp, blinding agony shot through his face. His jaw wouldn't move. It felt locked in a cage of wire and fire. He blinked his eyes open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital blinding him. As his vision swam into focus, he realized his head was heavily bandaged, and his jaw had been wired completely shut to stabilize a severe bilateral fracture. He wasn't alone in the room. Sitting in the vinyl visitor's chair next to his bed was William "Bill" Grady, the president of the local police union. Bill was a pragmatic, ruthless man who had spent a decade shielding bad cops from accountability. Harlan tried to speak, to ask Bill how quickly they could sue the military, but all that came out was a muffled, pathetic grunt through his wired teeth. Bill didn't look sympathetic. In fact, he looked like he was attending a funeral. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at Harlan with cold, dead eyes. "Don't try to talk, Vance," Bill said, his voice flat. "Just listen, because this is the last time you and I are ever going to have a conversation." Harlan's heart spiked, the heart monitor beside him beeping faster. Panic began to claw at his chest. "You really stepped in it this time, you arrogant fool," Bill continued, shaking his head slowly. "You didn't just hit a female soldier. You hit a federal undercover operative for Army CID. You assaulted a federal officer in a court of law, on camera in front of a sitting judge." Harlan's eyes widened to the size of saucers. Beneath the bandages, His skin went entirely pale. "Federal operative. 30 minutes after you got knocked into next week," Bill said, mercilessly delivering the karma. "The FBI and CID raided our precinct. They came in with federal warrants, Vance. They bypassed the chief. They bypassed me. They went straight to your locker and your desk." Harlan began to thrash weakly against the bedsheets, a muffled squeal of terror vibrating in his throat. "Yeah, they found it," Bill confirmed, his lip curling in disgust. "They found the ledger. They found the lockbox with the $6,000 in cash you extorted from those two privates last month. And they found the baggies of narcotics you've been using to plant on suspects who wouldn't pay your toll." The blue wall of silence, the unspoken brotherhood that had protected Harlan for 6 years, was evaporating before his eyes. "The union is dropping you, Vance, effective immediately," Bill stated, standing up and smoothing his tie. "You are radioactive. The police chief has already signed your termination papers. You aren't suspended with pay. You aren't on administrative leave. You are fired." Harlan reached out a desperate, trembling hand, tears of pain and absolute ruin pooling in the corners of his eyes. "And it gets worse," Bill added, pausing at the door, offering no comfort, only the brutal reality of Harlan's own making. "Rebecca Bennett, the prosecutor you left out to dry today, she just signed an immunity deal with the feds. She's turning state's witness. She's giving them every single illegal traffic stop, every falsified report, and every piece of dirty evidence you ever handed her." The monitor next to Harlan's bed began to blare an alarm as his heart rate skyrocketed into pure panic. He was trapped in a broken body, listening to his entire life be dismantled brick by brick. "When you get discharged from this hospital, Vance, there won't be a police cruiser waiting to take you home," Bill said softly, his hand on the door handle. "There will be 2 federal marshals waiting to transport you to a maximum security federal holding facility. You're looking at 20 years for the extortion and corruption, and another 10 for the assault on Sergeant Brooks." Bill opened the door, glancing back one final time at the shattered, ruined bully in the hospital bed. "You always wanted to be the toughest guy in the room, Vance," Bill muttered. "Let's see how tough you are when you're wearing an orange jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary, surrounded by the exact kind of people you used to frame." The door clicked shut, leaving Vance Harlan entirely alone with the agonizing throbbing of his wired jaw and the crushing, suffocating weight of his own absolute destruction. 6 months later, the suffocating, relentless humidity of a Tennessee summer hung heavy over the Dirksen Federal Courthouse in downtown Nashville. The atmosphere outside the building was a chaotic circus of satellite trucks, local reporters, and national correspondents. The story of a corrupt local cop unwittingly assaulting an undercover federal military operative on camera had become a national sensation. Inside courtroom 4B, however, the air was entirely different. It was heavily air-conditioned, smelling faintly of rich leather, lemon polish, and the sterile, unforgiving scent of federal justice. The stakes here were not local misdemeanors or slap-on-the-wrist suspensions. They were decades of hard federal time in maximum security facilities. Vance Harlan sat at the defense table, but he was utterly unrecognizable as the hulking, arrogant predator who had once strutted through the streets of Oak Ridge. County lockup had stripped him of his delusions and his muscle mass. He had lost 40 pounds, his previously barrel-chested frame now sagging beneath a drab, ill-fitting beige suit. His jaw, having finally healed from the brutal bilateral fracture Nadia had delivered, sat slightly off-center on his face, giving him a permanent, pathetic wince every time he swallowed. The swagger was completely gone. Only the hollow, terrified shell of a defeated man remained. When his high-priced private defense attorney, a ruthless legal shark funded by Harlan's hidden offshore accounts, had first reviewed the federal discovery file, he had immediately withdrawn as counsel. The FBI and Army CID hadn't just found loose cash in Harlan's locker. They had unleashed a technological nightmare upon his entire existence. Using advanced data analytics software from Palantir Technologies, a private intelligence firm utilized by the Department of Defense, federal forensic accountants had traced every single dollar Harlan had extorted from vulnerable soldiers over 4 years. Furthermore, the FBI's cyber division had utilized advanced UFED extraction tools to crack Harlan's encrypted burner phone, uncovering hundreds of text messages coordinating illegal stops, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. They had mapped his illicit network with terrifying microscopic precision, leaving absolutely no shadow for him to hide in. The blue wall of silence had shattered into dust. 6 of his fellow officers had already taken plea deals, turning state's evidence against him to save themselves. He was entirely alone, defended only by a court-appointed public defender named David Caldwell, a man who looked thoroughly exhausted and resigned to a brutal defeat. "The United States calls Staff Sergeant Nadia Brooks," announced the lead federal prosecutor, a razor-sharp, meticulously prepared woman named Sarah Bennett. The heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the gallery went pin-drop silent. Nadia walked down the center aisle. She was in her immaculate Army service uniform, but the brass on her chest told a profoundly updated story. Prominently displayed among her ribbons now sat the Meritorious Service Medal, awarded by the Department of the Army for her instrumental, highly classified role in dismantling the Oak Ridge corruption ring. She moved with the predatory, disciplined grace of a professional who had flawlessly executed a high-stakes mission. She took the witness stand, her posture impeccably straight, her face the exact same mask of absolute chilling composure that had driven Harlan to madness half a year prior. Harlan couldn't bring himself to look at her. He stared down at his trembling hands, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the defense table. The phantom pain in his jaw flared to life, the memory of her fist connecting with bone replaying behind his eyes in an endless, agonizing loop. "Sergeant Brooks," Prosecutor Bennett began, resting her hands lightly on the podium, "could you describe for the jury the specific operational parameters of your assignment in the town of Oak Ridge?" "My assignment was a deep-cover joint task force initiative between the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Nadia answered. Her voice rang out through the courtroom, clear, steady, and commanding. "Our target was a localized, highly organized syndicate operating within the Oak Ridge Police Department. This syndicate was specifically organized and directed by the defendant, Vance Harlan. Over a period of 18 months, we gathered actionable intelligence indicating that the defendant was systematically targeting junior enlisted personnel from Fort Campbell." A collective murmur rippled through the jury box. Nadia continued, her gaze sweeping over the jurors. "The defendant utilized illegal traffic stops to extort cash, seize personal property without warrants, and plant narcotics to secure false convictions, thereby leveraging those convictions to force the soldiers into paying exorbitant fines directly to his network. And on the day of the assault in the municipal courthouse, Sergeant Brooks, did you fear for your life when the defendant approached you?" Bennett asked, stepping out from behind the podium. Nadia's dark eyes drifted slowly to Harlan, pinning him to his chair like a biological specimen on a slide. "No, ma'am, I did not. I assessed the defendant as an undisciplined, emotionally compromised, and fundamentally untrained aggressor. When he initiated the unprovoked physical strike, I simply neutralized him utilizing standard military close-quarters combat protocols. My primary concern at that exact moment was not my physical safety, but ensuring his assault was fully documented on the courtroom security cameras to finalize the RICO indictment for this trial." Public Defender Caldwell stood up for cross-examination, looking very much like a man walking directly into a wood chipper. He adjusted his tie nervously. "Sergeant Brooks, isn't it true you deliberately provoked my client? You refused a lawful search of your vehicle on the night of your arrest. You embarrassed him in open court. You pushed a dedicated police officer to his breaking point. Nadia didn't flinch. She leaned slightly forward into the microphone. I calmly asserted my Fourth Amendment rights as a citizen of the United States, Counselor. I did not raise my voice, nor did I resist his unlawful physical force during the arrest. If a sworn police officer is provoked to the point of committing a felony assault simply because a black woman knows the law and refuses to be intimidated, then that officer is precisely the kind of violent criminal my task force was designed to eradicate from the streets. Caldwell swallowed hard, having absolutely no rebuttal for the sheer truth of her statement. No further questions, Your Honor. Prosecutor Bennett returned to the center of the floor, ready to deliver the final devastating blow. She queued up a massive high-definition monitor facing the jury box. Your Honor, the prosecution submits Exhibit F into evidence. This is the unedited, time-stamped security footage from the Oak Ridge Municipal Courthouse, retrieved directly from the server room by FBI agents 20 minutes after the assault took place. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the video began to play. It was crystal clear, capturing multiple angles of the room. The jury watched in stunned silence as Harlan, his face contorted in an ugly mask of rage, marched aggressively toward Nadia's defense table. The courtroom's highly sensitive transcription microphones had picked up the audio perfectly. The jury heard the venom in his voice. They heard the vile, undeniable racial slur hiss from his lips. And then they watched him wind up his arm and deliver the brutal, open-handed slap to Nadia's face. A gasp echoed from the gallery. But the video wasn't over. The jury watched karma deliver its instantaneous, undeniable verdict. In slow motion, they saw Nadia's head snap back to center. They saw the flawless, textbook pivot of her hips, the immediate transition from a passive stance to a lethal striking position. They watched the lightning-fast right connect directly with Harlan's exposed jaw. The impact on the screen was visceral. They watched the massive 240-pound bully lift inches off the ground, his eyes rolling back into his head before he even began his descent. They watched him fold onto the marble floor, completely unconscious, entirely broken by the woman he thought was beneath him. When the video finally ended and the lights came back up, the jury wasn't looking at Nadia with pity or shock. They were looking at Vance Harlan with absolute, unadulterated disgust. The trial was effectively over before the defense even had a chance to rest its non-existent case. The judge gave his instructions, and the jury filed out. They returned with a verdict in exactly 42 minutes. Guilty on all counts of racketeering, extortion, deprivation of rights under color of law, and the felony assault of a federal officer. The hammer of federal justice had finally fallen, and it had crushed Vance Harlan into dust. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later felt profoundly different from the rapid-fire adrenaline of the trial. It lacked the shock value of the video playback or the sharp, surgical dismantling of the cross-examination. Instead, the atmosphere in courtroom 4B had settled into something far heavier. The cold, inescapable, and permanent gravity of federal consequence. This was not a trial of facts. This was an execution of a career, a reputation, and a life. Judge William Harrison presided over the sentencing, appointed to the federal bench precisely for his draconian zero-tolerance policy regarding public corruption and civil rights violations. Harrison was a man who viewed a dirty badge not just as a crime, but as a treasonous breach of the public trust. He sat high behind the polished mahogany bench, staring down at the defense table with eyes that offered absolutely no quarter. Vance Harlan was ordered to stand. He no longer looked like a man. He looked like a hollowed-out ghost haunting his own ruined life. His legs, which had once confidently kicked open doors and stomped on the rights of innocent citizens, now shook so violently beneath the cheap fabric of his state-issued suit that a burly United States Marshal had to step forward gripping Harlan by the left elbow just to keep him entirely upright. The permanent crooked wince on Harlan's face twitched erratically as he stared up at the judge, his breathing shallow and erratic. The silence in the room stretched out, agonizing and deliberate. Judge Harrison let the weight of the moment press down on the disgraced officer before he finally spoke. "Vance Harlan," Judge Harrison's voice boomed, resonating through the high ceilings like thunder rolling across a dark valley. "You were entrusted with a sworn oath. You were handed a badge and a firearm, instruments meant to shield and protect the citizens of your community. You were given authority over your fellow man. Instead of honoring that profound responsibility, you chose to operate as a parasite. You twisted the law into a weapon of personal enrichment." Harlan closed his eyes, a single pathetic tear leaking from the corner and tracking down his pale, sunken cheek. "You specifically targeted the very men and women in uniform who volunteered to defend this nation," Judge Harrison continued, his tone dripping with an icy, unadulterated contempt. "You recognized their youth, their vulnerability in a town far from home, and their fear of military reprisal, and you weaponized it. You extorted them. You framed them for crimes they did not commit. You stole their money. You ruined their military careers. And when you were finally confronted by an officer of the law who refused to bow to your pathetic intimidation, you resorted to the cowardly, unprovoked violence of a street thug." Harlan's knees buckled slightly, but the marshal's iron grip kept him suspended. A pathetic, wet sob escaped his throat. "Please, Your Honor," Harlan begged, his voice cracking, sounding like a frightened child. I lost my temper. I made a mistake. I've lost everything. My pension, my wife, my home. Please." "You did not lose your temper, Mr. Harlan," the judge corrected him coldly, leaning forward over the bench. "You simply revealed your true nature. When a man feels his absolute power slipping, his reaction exposes exactly who he is beneath the uniform. You are a bully, a coward, and a disgrace to every honest law enforcement officer in this country. And the federal justice system has a very specific, very permanent cure for bullies." Judge Harrison picked up a thick stack of sentencing guidelines, squaring the edges on the wood with a sharp tap. "On the federal charges of racketeering, extortion, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and the felony assault of a federal officer, I sentence you to 240 months. That is 20 solid years in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, to be served at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta." Judge Harrison raised his heavy wooden gavel. "This sentence is mandatory minimum. There will be no leniency. There will be no possibility of early parole. May God have mercy on your soul, Mr. Harlan, because the inmates in a maximum security federal facility certainly will not." Crack. The sound of the gavel striking the sound block was deafening. To Harlan, it sounded like the slamming of a coffin lid. The immediate sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Harlan's wrists was the only noise that followed. As the U.S. Marshals forcibly turned him around to drag him toward the holding cells, his legs finally gave out entirely. They practically had to carry him. Before he crossed the threshold into the holding area, Harlan cast one final, desperate, terrified look back at the gallery. Staff Sergeant Nadia Brooks was standing in the back row. She was perfectly still, her hands resting easily behind her back in a parade rest. She didn't smirk. She didn't offer a triumphant smile or a mocking wave. She simply looked at him with the chilling professional detachment of a soldier who had successfully neutralized a high-value target. As their eyes met for the final time, Nadia gave him a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement of absolute victory. The mission was accomplished, and the trash had finally been taken out. 2 weeks later, the crushing reality of Harlan's new existence truly set in. He was loaded onto a heavily armored federal transport bus, his wrists and ankles bound in heavy chains that clinked with every bump in the highway. The journey to Georgia was a silent, agonizing descent into hell. When the bus finally pulled through the massive, reinforced steel gates of USP Atlanta, the towering concrete walls seemed to blot out the sun itself. Inside the processing center, his identity was methodically stripped away. His civilian clothes were confiscated. He was aggressively scrubbed down in a freezing shower, his head shaved to the scalp. The man who used to demand respect on the streets of Oak Ridge was handed a folded stack of rough, scratchy orange fabric. He was no longer Officer Vance Harlan. He was officially stripped down to an administrative number, inmate 88491042. As he was led by two heavily armed corrections officers toward his assigned cell block, the noise hit him like a physical blow. The cell block was a multi-tiered concrete cavern, a chaotic, deafening cacophony of shouting voices, clanking metal doors, and the heavy, suffocating scent of bleach and despair. Harlan walked down the center tier, his eyes glued to the scuffed concrete floor, terrified to look up. But the inmates knew. News travels faster than light inside a federal penitentiary, especially when it concerns a dirty cop. Many of these men had been transferred from local and state facilities. Many of them had experienced the exact kind of corrupt, badge-heavy brutality that Harlan used to deal out daily. An inmate leaning casually against the steel bars of his cell smiled as Harlan was marched past. The man had a deep scar running down his cheek and eyes that held absolutely no warmth. "Hey there, officer," the inmate whispered, his voice slicing through the noise, sending a violent shudder of pure terror down Harlan's spine. "Welcome to the real world. We've been waiting for you." Harlan stepped into his tiny 8x10 concrete cell. The air was stale and suffocating. The heavy steel door slid shut behind him on automated tracks, engaging with a final, echoing, mechanical thud that reverberated in his chest. It sounded exactly like the judge's gavel. He sat heavily on the thin, lumpy mattress, his hands trembling violently. He buried his face in his rough, calloused hands, and for the first time in his life he truly wept. There was no shiny badge to hide behind anymore. There was no corrupt union boss to protect him. There was only the cold concrete, the unforgiving steel bars, and 20 long years of the hardest, most brutal karma imaginable waiting for him in the dark. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away in a bustling city on the East Coast, Staff Sergeant Nadia Brooks sat quietly in the driver's seat of an unmarked, tinted sedan. The rain drummed a steady rhythm against the windshield. She raised a pair of high-powered binoculars to her eyes, focusing clearly on a man in an expensive suit taking a suspicious envelope in a dark alleyway. The world was full of corrupt, arrogant men who believed they were entirely untouchable, and she was going to systematically break every single one of them. In that silent courtroom, the loudest sound wasn't the slap. It was the moment Nadia refused to become what her bully expected. A corrupt officer tried to shrink her with lies, insults, and violence, betting that fear would make her fold. But she held her posture, her principles, and her patience, because real strength isn't screaming back. It's staying anchored when someone is trying to pull you into their storm. And when the line was crossed, she responded with disciplined precision, not reckless rage, proving that self-control can be both mercy and power. The lesson is simple, but it cuts deep. Your character is revealed most clearly when you're provoked. Life will send people who push your buttons, bosses, strangers, even friends, hoping you'll react so they can label you the problem. Don't give them that gift. Know your values, know your rights, build skills in the quiet days so you don't break on the hard ones, because consequences always arrive. Sometimes instantly, sometimes months later, but they arrive with receipts. The bully in the story thought a badge made him untouchable. He learned that integrity, evidence, and accountability hit harder than ego ever could. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. When was the last time you stayed calm while your heart was on fire? What lesson did you learn the hard way? And if you want more powerful real-life lessons like this, stories that remind us we're stronger than we think, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.